Okay, let's get started. This is going to be Miami time to its extreme. So it's I'm the lucky one who gets to briefly introduce Shinn Cunningham. Barb comes to us today from the Neuroscience Institute at Carnegie Mellon University, where she's director. I first met Barb as a young graduate student in Boston when she was still with.
When he was a young graduate student, I was already old. Just to be clear.
Yeah. You were,
no, it was unclear,
yeah,
ambiguous.
If that was ambiguous, I was the young graduate student. Barb was with the Department of Biomedical Engineering and Cognitive and Neural Systems at BU for a long time. And her background is in electrical engineering, where she earned a bachelor's degree at Brown, and then master's and PhD degrees at MIT with the now deceased Nat Durlock, rest in peace, working on questions of auditory psychophysics and more recently auditory electrophysiology and neuroimaging. So let's please join me in welcoming Shinn Cunningham. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Can everybody hear me? Okay, because that's highly amplified. I wasn't sure if you were picking up. Anyhow, sorry for the delays. We have a human clicker over there, and the bad news is I'm going to be going it's like beep, and you can advance or something. I don't know. So beep. So. I am an engineer, and I came to become a neuroscientist, sort of, but as you will see, click. Oh, you're going to have to be active. I tend to just advance a bunch. I want to just tell you, I am director and professor of the Neuroscience Institute, but I've never, ever in my life taken a neuroscience course, advance. I'm a professor of psychology, but never took a psychology course. I am biomedical engineering, and last class I had in biology was in Daytona Beach in the public school system, and it was a horrible, horrible experience, and I learned nothing. But I am in ECE at Carnegie Mellon, and I actually do have degrees in that, so that's good. But I want you to know, that's really important. So I am an impostor. Anybody who suffers from imposter syndrome, I am it embodied. So that's something to know. And I want to just tell you about what I study. So I study the cocktail party problem, and click. If you're in a cocktail party, click, click. The problem is, oh no, now you've gone too far. Go back, go back. Click, click, click. Yeah, see, this works better because it's well oiled when I'm doing it. So the thing about a cocktail party that's really fascinating is all the sound is out there in the world. It adds up before it even gets into your brain. Yet your brain is remarkably good at pulling apart the information, allowing you to listen to one thing and ignore everything else. And that problem is a very, very difficult problem to solve, and it actually depends on all sorts of prior information. It's not just in the acoustics, it's in natural sounds and what happens in our knowledge in our brain of what constitutes a natural sound that probably constitutes a source out there in the world. But the remarkable thing, not only can we solve that problem of separating the sounds, but once we do, we're able to focus at the cocktail party on an interesting conversation, like maybe the stuff going down here. But I swear to God, I always am this person stuck talking to that guy, which is not the fun guy at the party, right? But the neat thing is, I can be nodding and pretending to pay attention and grunting at the right moments while listening to this person while actually eavesdropping on something else. Or at least, I used to be able to do that pretty well. It turns out that the older you get, the harder that gets. It turns out that any insult to the auditory system disrupts this process. And in a young, healthy adult, it's actually incredibly easy to eavesdrop and pay attention to whatever you wish. But because it's such a computationally demanding problem, it requires the auditory system to be extremely good at resolving the sound. And any hearing loss will get in the way of this process, which makes it hard for me as I age. Any communication deficit, any kind of atypical neural processing can get in the way of this problem. So this is like the canary in the coal mine for auditory neuroscience. It's one of the most challenging things we do. We do it every day, and it's the place where problems show up first, kind of. So that's the problem. And the thing about it is, I came at this from an engineering point of view. And when I entered the field 25 years ago, it really was from an electrical engineering viewpoint, where if I'm looking for my son in a scene, my son is in that scene, I can find him eventually when I'm looking for him, but it takes me a while. And to an engineer, that's actually kind of a shocking thing, because the information is perfectly available. My son's face isn't obscured in any way, yet it takes time to find him in that scene. Advance again. Here's another scene. And it's a little cartoon. My other son is in this scene. If you advance once, there he is. That's my son, Will. The effect of paying attention to him in the scene, in the brain, literally, is to turn down the representation of everything that I'm not paying attention to and gating through the information that I'm interested in. The actual information getting to the cortex changes due to how I'm focusing attention. And this is actually kind of interesting if you advance. I like to use these slides. These are my children, and advance again. Here they are. Yeah. So, yeah, I've been using these slides really for a long, long time. And yeah, go ahead. Why the goofy intro? I think it's really important to talk about this. And the older I've gotten, the more I've realized that talking about, no, you're getting out of control again. Just wait. Let me just pause here for a second. It's really important to talk about all the things that go into life. And the fact is, I do have children. They were really important to me. They remain important to me, but now they're grown adults and they don't need me so much. But I think it's really important to mention that. And I've intentionally used those slides forever because they're my children and it's an example of that. But now I've become so intentional about it, I want to call it out and say, yes, I'm doing it intentionally because you can actually be a scientist and be a mother and be a father, and that's important. And you need to know there are examples of being able to balance that. So, onward. Why is that so interesting? So back to the science of it. Why is it so interesting to think about this problem as an engineer? Well, there are all sorts of people that have done auditory neuroscience work or auditory perception work, and advance again. From an engineering perspective, it was all driven by Bell Telephone Labs, interested in communicating over a limited bandwidth communication device. And from that, all sorts of information, we learned all sorts of information about what the auditory system is sensitive to. But the problem is almost all of the work that came out of Bell Labs, as brilliant and important as it was, looked at the information available to the brain in an ideal observer kind of model. That is, what is it that the brain can detect? And the thing about the examples I showed you, those pictures or the cocktail party, the pictures of the visual crowded scene, the truth is information may be available on the periphery of the ear or on the retina, yet still not be processed, still not be gated through. So you are not actually an ideal observer of the sensory information you're receiving. You're having to make choices about what to process and what not to process. And that is a really interesting thing that Bell Telephone Labs early experiments never addressed, and that engineers entering the field of auditory neuroscience didn't really grapple with until about the time I entered the field is when we started to think about the system, not only from a bottom-up kind of perspective, but thinking about the top-down ways in which information is transformed in the brain. And that's something I've been really interested in looking at. So now we're going to have sound examples that may or may not even be audible. They're way over there now and not mic'd. But let me just introduce this. You're going to hear a sound mixture. And you're going to be able to hear out sounds in this mixture. I want you to listen, if we can hear it, hopefully it's loud enough, to listen for the sentence that starts her shaky, and it's spoken about that rate, very over-articulated. So I'm going to ask you to listen carefully to the sentence starting her shaky, and let's see.
Her shaky increases and will leap to carpet.
Who got the sentence? What? You lie. He's lying. He's like, I did. You're overachiever. Guess. Her shaky something left at the carpet. Okay. Of course, it's a bad example on purpose. Advance. So there are two sound mixtures, two sentences in this mixture. It's a very unnatural situation. Here's a question for you. Nobody's sure that they got the sentence. How many people heard words? Think about what that means. You couldn't separate the words into two separate streams, because it's this weird-ass artificial example. If I really probed you, you often were hearing co-articulated words where the sound stream ran together without a pause, but this example is sort of engineered. You see those 0 points? There's a red, this is time versus amplitude of these waveforms. There are points in time where both of those sentences went through 0 together. It's spoken by the same talker. There's no spatial separation. It's out of this terrible computer system way over there. And there's no semantic content here, because the sentences are nonsense sentences. If you advance, we're going to hear one of them.
Her shaky increases squirrel.
So you heard words, but they weren't the right words. Play the next one.
The greedy pole ends at the carpet.
So you're hearing pairs of words that are co-articulated and are therefore contiguous in time frequency. But there's nothing to help you sort out when those both cross zero. Now this is really unnatural. If I'm speaking and a man's speaking at the same time, the timbre of our voices is enough to let your brain solve the problem. But examples like this kind of prove a bunch of points. You need some feature, some high-level feature to allow you to solve the problem of what belongs together. It's prior information that the timbre of a voice doesn't change much, right? But even in the instantaneous mixture, the words themselves are something your brain can solve because of the structure of the acoustic waveforms themselves. Knowledge about harmonic sounds tend to belong together. Knowledge about, even on the ear, if the frequencies are represented in parallel channels, even if the frequencies are far separated, if they're turning on and off together, they're probably from the same source. That's not necessarily true. When people are singing in a choir, they're turning on and off together. They're actually separate sources. It's ambiguous for your brain often if they're good singing, if it's good singing, because of that artificial coordination of those voices. But what this proves to you, if you advance again, is that there's an ability of the brain to take what is acoustically ambiguous, but use prior knowledge and structure of the sound to figure out and solve the problem. So I can make it ambiguous so that it fails in certain ways, but even then words themselves are structured enough that the spectrotemporal structure allows you to solve the problem of what is a word in this mixture. So we're doing this using prior information, and it turns out only within about the last 2 years have some of the deep neural nets been able to solve this mixture problem in the acoustic world. And they do it by observing more examples of speech than you will ever experience in your lifetime. Think about that. A 2-year-old has less experience than the machine algorithm needs to solve the problem, right? So that tells you that there's something hardwired in how our brains are structured to pull out the relevant cues, to pull out the right representation such that the features allow you to solve these problems. So there's enough statistical structure in natural sounds in the world to solve the problem. You can prove that with these deep neural net algorithms. But actually, our brains already have knowledge in terms of how it's wired, what features of sound are getting represented in the brain. So that's kind of fun. This is an example of a visual example of that mixture. There are words there, and you may be able to tease them apart if you concentrate and focus. But if you click, if I differentiate the words, which is a more natural scene, if there's different sources out there that are different in some of their characteristics, suddenly the whole way you process the scene changes. Instead of being effortful to segregate one word from another, that happens naturally, which frees you up in time to read each word individually. The other thing that happens, though, is you read each word individually. You no longer see this as one mass, which means you serially query one and then the next and then the next, which is how we tend to process the world. We process one thing at a time. We do it fairly rapidly. How many of you, I know I'm guilty, I'm watching TV and I'm listening to my husband at the same time? Actually, what you're doing is a very rapid serial switch. And with my husband, we've been married a quite long time. I could probably tell you what he's saying right now with pretty high probability, right? So I don't need to hear every single syllable of what he's saying in order to understand his message. I can hear and still, there's all sorts of content in speech. And the redundancy of those messages allows you to code switch, to switch between. And you're not really processing two things at once. You're just sharing rapidly. And the predictability of the content lets you fill in the meaning. And we do this automatically all the time. And you can show this in experiments by literally taking out pieces of words and putting noise there instead. And it's equally intelligible because you don't need all of the syllables. There's enough information there. So I'm going to give you now another example. This is another sound mixture that you actually should be able to solve. And it's a phone number I'm going to have you listen for. It's a male voice. It's only 7 digits. How many of you, it's a mostly engineering crowd, I think. How many of you have ever heard of the 7 ± 2 phenomenon? Can you describe it for us? It's Miller's magic number, which if you don't know who Miller was, probably still doesn't help. So.
George Miller, 1956 paper, he was looking at information processing and the use of chunking and minimization
Yep.
to facilitate how much you can store in working memory.
Right. So I used to live in the 904 area code, and if you're from the 904 area code, 904 is like a thing that you hear as 1. I don't have to remember 904. 904, it's the North Florida, right? So that's a chunk. But you can only store 7 things that are independent items, plus or minus, and still remember them in short-term memory. So I'm about to play for you a 7-digit phone number. It's right on the edge of what you should be able to do. But I'm going to ask you, somebody, to be brave enough to tell me what it was. Is everybody ready? So you're going to have to focus. That's what I'm telling you. But you're going to listen for a metallic-sounding male voice from over there, because it's way over there. Are you ready?
3, 5, 3, 4, 3, 4, 2.
Who can tell me what it was? This guy.
3, 5, 3, 4, 3, 4, 2.
3, 5. How many got it? Actually, stand up if you got it. Stand up. It's a good exercise. So most of you are standing up. Oh, stay up for just a sec. Of those of you who are standing up who got the phone number, stay standing if you can tell me anything else about the mixture. Oh, okay. This is great. Like I said, I've been using these slides for forever. Without ruining it for everybody, can anybody tell me any of the content of the rest of of what was in there? Okay, but of the 3 of you, what could you hear?
A female voice?
A female voice. This is a perfect demonstration. The longer I had waited to ask, the less people would be able to recall. If right after I'd played it, I'd said, yeah, but what else was there? Some of you might even have been able to pull up something. But you're not really, you haven't processed it, you haven't really stored it, but you have a kind of memory of the sensory experience that you can play back and pull stuff out. So I'm going to just play exactly, so actually advance 1. So you could hear the male voice, advance again. There it is, quieter. Advance again. That's my friend Steve Colburn's number. If you put the chunk 617, which is the area code for Boston first, he's a wonderful guy. Call him quickly. He's about to retire. I may have to re-record all of my stimuli, but I've been using this for like 15 years. He's a wonderful 617-353-4342. Just call him. He's awesome. But now what I'm going to do, advance 1 more time. What was the other signal? 1 more time. Okay, it's me. A younger me. Listen now, same example, but listen for me.
3, 5, 3, 4, 3, 4, 2.
Because it's hard to understand 2 things at once. Advance twice. Yeah, yeah. So anybody, I have all sorts of engineered tricks here that make this example work. Anybody want to guess what some of them are? There's so many things I did to set you up. Volume. My voice is 5 decibels lower than the phone number. So it's not going to interject. It's not going to interrupt attention that you've already focused. Oh, hell yeah. Oh my God, it's hard. It's 7 plus or minus 2. It's on the edge of what you're going to be able to remember. You're all overachievers. You're sitting here, right? Oh my God, I'm going to get it right. I'm going to work hard. That makes you focus hard, right? So absolutely. Anybody else?
You had it at like, I don't know, like a hertz or 2 hertz for the number, but your voice was
More rapid. Yeah, absolutely.
So your voice started after the minute?
My voice started second. Absolutely. So you latched on to the voice that you knew you had to attend. You're focused because it's hard. You're going to get it right. I'm going to call on you. Oh, no. All of those things help. There's one other super important one.
Noise?
There's no noise.
The robotic voice.
The robotic voice made it very distinct. That actually helps. Even if there was natural voice, it actually turns out it's actually half of the speech spectrum has been thrown away. It's bandpass filtered into the bandpass. Every other one is thrown away. And that was for reasons that we had experiments where you present half of the sound in one ear, half in the other, and they're interdigitated in spectrum so they don't interfere in the periphery, and to show that these effects are more central. Makes it sound cool, but that's not the critical one. What about this? If I tell you the phone number is 12616, what's next? I have no idea. If I tell you the next word coming out of my mouth, so that's another trick. You may not realize that you know it, but you know. You're at the bar, you ask for somebody's number, you miss one number, you're never seeing that person again, right? There is no predictability to the phone number, and that's really critical because whether you know it or not, you knew you could not afford to deviate attention or you would not get the number. So all of these things are things. It's both cognitive and it's kind of how much you're focusing. All of these things are engineered, but then there's the acoustics of the signals. The voice you're listening to starts first. The other voice starts second, but is quieter, so it's not going to grab attention involuntarily. It turns out if they were roughly equal, when my voice starts, it would involuntarily make you switch attention to it, but just making it a little bit quieter, it's not salient enough to interrupt attention. So all of these things make it work. But the phenomenal thing is you literally don't have access to that information when you're focused and your attention is focused. It's filtered out. It doesn't get to cortex. So that's pretty phenomenal. And that is very much not what Bell telephone operators, or researchers were looking at when they were looking at ideal observer models. The information is in the acoustics. It's available to your brain if you had gated it through, but you cannot listen to multiple things at once and actually process them for meaning simultaneously. So that's what I study. I study the processes. And what's really fun about this is the process that allows you to do that is a very complicated interplay between different brain regions. And I'm going to show you some movies. Go ahead. This was an experiment we did a while ago. I'm just going to, because of the time, just advance. One more time. This is a picture of the brain. It's blown up because the brain is convoluted. It's folded. And the dark and light areas are folds of the brain. But this is blown up so you can see the surface. Back here is the back of the brain. This is sort of aimed this way. This is visual cortex back here. And in this experiment, we play a visual cue first. And the visual cue tells people how to listen. So if you advance, we'll see this lighting up in the back of the brain in visual cortex. This is MEG data. That's the brain processing this visual cue. But what that visual cue tells the person is in an upcoming mixture of sounds, listen to the location on either the left or the right. And then what we looked at, if we advance again, one time, is the brain processing all of that information. And the thing to note is this is when the sound starts and the brain lights up all over. But the thing to know is between the time the visual cue came in and before the sound started, there was all sorts of activity. And it was activity preparing the brain to suppress sound in one direction and let through the sound from the other direction. So knowing that you're going to have to listen in a particular direction sets up these kinds of interactions across these different brain regions that is affecting this control. Yeah?
Was that a language? Was that a words that were speaking?
It was a hyper simple, the actual experiment was a pair of words are played. They're digits, because digits don't have content in this way, and it's a nice closed set. One was high-pitched, one was low-pitched, one was left, and one was right. And in the experiment, that visual cue is either telling you left, right, high pitch, or low pitch. And it turns out this is the activity you would see if you do this task based on location rather than based on the pitch. You get a different picture of solving that same task if you do exactly the same thing, but solve it based on pitch.
I ask because it looks like a lot of language centers are being activated there if you show objects.
So this is MEG data, which means there's a huge amount of point spread. It's very hard to actually analyze in detail. It's not like an fMRI image where we're very precise about where. So the thing that turns out to the only significant, really truly significant area that's differently active turns out to be areas, that top hotspot, which is probably the frontal eye fields. There are language centers involved in this processing. There's all sorts of stuff that goes on. But the one that is statistically significant and reliably so is that frontal eye field top area, which we'll talk about more. For those of you who aren't neuroscientists, I'm sorry for the jargon that I just threw at this nice man who clearly knows more than some of you may. But this is really just an illustration of this interplay. This isn't to make a hard point about which areas are more or less active, but let's show some data that does exactly that, using fMRI. So this is some stuff that I did with a colleague of mine who's a vision scientist, and we contrasted parts of the brain that are active during visual tasks compared to auditory tasks. Advance again. And what we did is we played mixtures that included a visual image on the left and a visual image on the right, and sound on the left and the sound on the right. And on any one block of trials, we told people to listen to the thing on the left, look to the thing at the left, or listen or look on the right. And then we contrasted. So the visual and auditory inputs are always the same. People's eyes are fixated in front. And we contrasted what parts of the brain are more active during the visual attention task and what parts are more active during the auditory. So we've equated the sensory inputs are the same. It's just what parts of the brain are more engaged in controlling attention to vision versus audition. And the thing that was really fun about this is you see this interdigitation. If I go, these frontal areas along the front of the brain are the areas that are involved in kind of executive control, executive function. And what's interesting is almost all of the studies that have been done before this one do a very common co-registration of brain activity. They take known landmarks, anatomical landmarks in the brain, and morph individual brains onto each other. And when you do that sort of thing, you don't see a very clear pattern of differences between visual and auditory attention. It turns out there is a pattern, but it's very individual. And the only way to define that reliably is to do a task that differentiates one person's brain from another. And in the individual, you can see blue, red, and it turns out blue, red. There's actually sets of areas that are more biased towards representing visual or auditory as you go down the brain. The back of the brain is blue in this picture because that's visual cortex. That kind of big swath of activity in the center of the brain is along this fold of this major fold of the brain. That's the auditory cortex, so it's more active during auditory tasks. But the thing that's interesting is this interdigitation in these frontal regions that are sort of decision-making regions. And it turns out these are very reliably different. If we advance again. We advance a few times, I've got labels. These are just anatomical labels. It turns out these areas are so reliable, we did a replication of this task a few years later. Only instead of contrasting vision versus audition for the same sensory inputs, we contrasted a working memory task, a task that makes you process and then hold in memory information that was either visual or auditory. The visual task is a very common visual cognitive neuroscience task. They played a series of images, and when you see an image that had happened to before, it's a target and you have to press a button. So you have to wait, you have to hold in memory the previous and the penultimate one before that, and then press a button. And we either had male or female faces. Abby Noyce, who's this awesome now professor, actually came up with an auditory version of male versus female faces, which is cat and dog sounds. And I'm now going to let you to participate if we advance again. Hit one more time. We're going to do the auditory version. So raise your hand when you hear a repeat. Oh, that was two back. Okay, you get the idea. Advance again. I just love that example just because it's so amusing. So imagine sitting in a scanner listening to dogs and cats doing this. It's just awesome. What's amazingly cool, though, is this lab tends to use the same subjects over and over. So 2 years later, we had this original paper shown on the left. 2 years later, that same subject came back. That same subject in this other experiment shows exactly the same pattern. And if you look and co-register these brains, which are the same brains, there's an 80% overlap of these frontal regions. These are very stable, very, very clearly auditory, visual, auditory, visual, auditory, visual. And this is, like I said, it's something that unless you look at the individual level of the individual anatomy, you don't see this pattern. It's only by looking at the individual brain that you see this interdigitation. And these areas really form different networks. What's really funky, and I can't remember if I included, can you advance one more? Yeah, I did include it. Advance. What's really funky is these interdigitated regions actually form networks. The visual areas talk to, if you just look at kind of random activity in the brain when people aren't actually doing any specific task, it's kind of a random walk through brain state, if you want to think of it that way. The areas that are biased towards representing vision are also on when the visual areas in the back of the brain are engaged. If you advance one more, the auditory control regions talk to auditory space, the auditory cortex. Advance one more. Here's what's whacked out. If I ask someone to do spatial processing of sound, it engages the frontal areas that are visually biased, as well as parts of this back part of the brain, the parietal cortex, which isn't purely visual. It's known to be multisensory, but it's this representation of spatial control that only becomes active if you're processing the spatial location of sound. Not if you're doing, pitch processing, not if you're doing just the content of the speech, but if you're making use of the spatial information of the sound, it engages these areas. So it's like the auditory system co-ops the visual system network to make sense of spatial information. Advance again. Yeah, blah, 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 advance again. So I think for sake of time, this is, you can decode all sorts of stuff from the brain activity, and we play games like that. I'll just advance one more time. Here's a cool little illustration of, you can decode from EEG now, kind of brain states having to do with these differences in attentional control, whether you're doing something based on space or doing something based on pitch. So I don't want to take the time to go through it because we got to this late start, but I want to talk about this parietal areas. So this is a top-down view of the brain. So imagine I'm lying like this. So here's the back of the brain, that parietal area that I was just talking about. It turns out the parietal area is known to have maps of external locations in space, and they represent the opposite hemifield. So if there's two people out in front, advance, the thing on the left gets represented on the right, the thing on the right gets represented on the left. It turns out it's a little asymmetrical. Hit one more time. Whoop. Now we're going crazy. Right here. It turns out there's a little asymmetry, which is well known in vision. Things on the right in the external world get mostly represented on the left, but a little bit represented on the right, and you'll see that in some of the data. It turns out that's true in vision, and it turns out this is true in the auditory system as well. So this is background. Imagine I'm attending, okay, hit. I'm going to attend, hit, to the left and ignore the thing on the right. What that's going to do is lead to suppression of the parietal area on the left, which is mainly representing the right. And it turns out in the vision domain, it's really well known that when you do that, hit one more time, there's a signature that you can see in EEG, an electrical activity coming off the brain. There's this particular range of frequencies called alpha. It ranges from about 8 to 12 hertz that's elevated over the region of cortex that's being the spatial side that's being suppressed. So if I'm paying attention to the left, the right is the thing I want to suppress, I'm going to see enhancement of alpha over left cortex, parietal cortex, which is the part representing the part of space I'm trying to suppress. This is part of what you're doing when you're listening in space. So it turns out, this was well known in the visual domain, and it turns out it's true in the auditory domain as well. What we did is played a bunch of sounds from minus 600, minus 250, 0, 250, or 600 microseconds of time difference between the ears. So one of the main cues for left for right in the sound system is which ear gets the sound first. And by varying the timing between the left and the right ear signals, I can make sounds like they're coming from different places. Make sounds sound like they're coming from different places. And I did this in a background of other sounds. But I told you ahead of time exactly where the sound was you were supposed to pay attention to, and then measured alpha activity in left parietal cortex and right parietal cortex. And what you'll see is this beautiful gradation. As if you hit one more time, if I'm listening to the left, I'm going to see increased alpha ipsilaterally, which is suppressing the contralateral side of space. And hit it again. If I'm looking at this side, it reverses and goes down. You'll notice it's, one more point to make. It's not perfectly symmetric. This goes from positive to negative. This one goes from 0 to positive. That's that asymmetry I was talking about. It's really common and really prevalent. But the thing to notice is there's this beautiful gradient. As I switch attention, there's like this gradient of this alpha activity that is part of controlling spatial attention. Hit it again. Any questions? I'm kind of racing through because we got to a late start. Okay, so what's really funny though, space, to use auditory space, you're co-opting this visual network. That's a pretty wacky thing. And in the natural world, it's pretty unusual to have space be necessary. What do I mean by that? If I'm talking and Andy starts talking, he sounds different than me. Yeah, he's coming from a different direction. Maybe you see he's over there and you can direct to that location your attention. But the minute he starts talking, you can latch onto his voice, and you don't really need space to solve this problem anymore. And so it turns out, In the auditory system, if I give you a spatial attention task, you can see this alpha activity play out before the sound even starts. You'll see this alpha activity pulling attention one way or the other. If space is necessary to help you solve the problem, like imagine two identical twins talking from different directions and space is the only thing helping you, you'll see alpha activity that stays on throughout the presentation. But if it's Andy and me, you may imagine you're blindfolded and you don't know who's on which side, but I tell you to listen to the person on the left. You would start by using alpha to pull attention one way or the other, but the minute you latch on to that voice, whether it's me or Andy, you don't need space and it goes away. So that's what this is showing. We did an experiment in which there were melodies, and you're paying attention to a melody that was either on the left or the right. There were 3 melodies to make it hard. And the melodies were either far apart in frequency or close together in frequency. And I think I actually have the sound examples if you hit once. It's impossible to hear it. They're weird, terrible, little awful melodies of 2 notes. Play it again. The next one is harder. So the point is, if you could hear them well, the second example is very hard to pull apart. It sounds like one mass of notes. The first one, there's actually differences in the pitch enough that you can keep them straight without using space. But if you hit, when you pay attention, your brain will suppress the thing that you're ignoring. This is EEG activity, so it's electrical activity that's been time locked to the sounds. The vertical lines are the points in time at which notes play either from the left in blue or from the right in red. And what I'm showing you is for the same sound, for exactly the same electrical sensor, I'm showing you the electrical activity that ends up being time locked to events. The thing to note is there's a difference between the red line and the blue line in each of these plots. And in fact, if you look here, here's a blue note onset. That's a note from the left. And when you're attending to the left, shown in dark, the solid blue, there's a big negative excursion, but not when you're ignoring that sound. Here there's a note from the right, and the red is lower than the blue. Here's a note from the left, the blue is lower than the red. Here's a note from the right, the red is lower than the blue. Here's blue, blue is lower than. Every time you're attending to a sound, you get this negativity that's elicited by a note that's attended, but not when it's being ignored. That's true whether the pitch separation is large or small. Your brain is suppressing the thing you're ignoring, whether the pitches are far apart or close together. But advance one more. But what's interesting is if you look at that alpha activity and look at this lateralization of alpha, if I look in the small Q period, the small Qs, when the pitches aren't enough to help your brain do this, you see this strong alpha activity that's lateralized, both before the sound starts and throughout the sound presentation. Hit it again. When there's a big pitch difference, so it's like Andy versus me, before the sound starts, you see that alpha activity, but it goes away during the sound presentation. So you start by co-opting this visual control network that's spatial, but once you latch onto the sound, if you don't need space, you don't continue that kind of spatial attention. How are we doing? So we have also done stuff like this with people who have hearing impairment. Even a small hearing impairment ends up messing up your ability to pay attention to things. And what we did is looked at whether you could pay attention to sounds from a particular direction when they were close together in space or far apart in space, both for normal hearing listeners here and hearing impaired listeners. And you can see the hearing impaired listeners are bad at this task. Advance again. It turns out that the hearing impaired listener, this is the normal hearing listeners, if you measure how well the individual listener is at making use of spatial information and measure their threshold for small timing differences between the ears, that's what's plotted along the left axis. And it turns out how well an individual listener performs on these tasks actually varies, even in the normal listeners. And the people who have big thresholds are the people that are bad. They need a big difference to be able to hear that there's a difference. If you look at what happens with the hearing impaired, the same thing it holds true. It's not as clean. The thing to note is look at this x-axis. This is going up to 200 microseconds, whereas that was 60 microseconds range for the normal hearing. So these are listeners who are really bad at using space. They're very insensitive to spatial information, and they're bad at spatial attention. Which is interesting only, I mean, it seems sort of obvious, except that nobody had really seen consistent problems with spatial hearing in people with, modest hearing loss, but it is there. It actually is present, and it's one of the things contributing to making them worse at these kinds of tasks. The thing that I think is most interesting about this, though, is if you look at what happens to this alpha, this is a task where we're using alpha. We're trying to make you use spatial attention, and you should have this push-pull of alpha to direct spatial attention. If you look at the normal hearing listeners, they have this lateralization of alpha. There's a difference in this distribution of alpha depending on which direction they're attending. Advance again. If I look at the difference between having a small ITD versus a large ITD, for the normal hearing listeners, there's lateralization even for a small ITD attention, and those differences get bigger if the attention is spread to farther apart spaces, just like we saw before. But what's wacky is the normal hearing listeners show this lateralization. These are hearing impaired listeners. What we're actually looking at is this preparatory activity. We tell them with a visual cue where to pay attention. There's no impairment in their visual system. They know they should be listening in a particular direction. They should be trying to do that, but they're not even able to try, if you want to think of it that way. This is before the sound starts, based on a visual cue. You wouldn't necessarily, even if they're bad at the task, they should be trying to. It's almost as if somehow their mapping from of sound space to this visual network isn't quite calibrated anymore. They have not been using that information, perhaps. It's not available to them, so they no longer even are effective at using this visual network. Yeah?
Does a hearing aid make a difference?
Does a hearing aid make a difference was the question, and the answer is maybe. We didn't test it. These listeners were not severely hearing impaired. They actually had modest to mild to moderate hearing loss, and a lot of people with mild to moderate hearing loss don't find hearing aids particularly helpful and tend not to wear them that often. But we didn't ask them. This is without hearing aids under headphones.
I was about to ask a question you kind of answered already, but what I was curious about the degree of the loss and by the frequency. So is this like a typical age-related, like high-frequency sloping loss?
So most of these, so the question was, what kind of hearing loss did these listeners have? And the answer is, it was mild to moderate. We didn't, because it's really a pain in the butt to try, this was back at Boston University where I didn't actually have a clinic nearby. So it was hard to recruit them, and we were pretty open about anybody who fell into the mild to moderate hearing loss, symmetric, so left and right ear had to be pretty within, I think, 10 dB, 5 dB. Of each other in terms of the thresholds as a function of frequency. It was definitely the case that most of them had typical age-related hearing loss, which looks like high frequencies are affected, but not so much low frequencies. So it's a sloping loss, the words that were asked. So yes, absolutely, most of them had that, but not all. But it was never more than moderate, and it was bilateral and symmetric. And what was interesting was this relationship, in our minds, what was interesting was there was this very direct relationship to show that the spatial acuity differed in these listeners. Follow up?
The question to that would be, since you're not controlling for the type and degree of loss, did you see in every single patient regardless, or every single subject regardless of the presentation of the hearing?
Yeah, so if you go back 2 slides, I think, or a couple clicks. So this, go forward one more. This is every individual listener, right? So there's huge variability. And the question was, did you see deficits in everybody? And the answer is actually not. Like, if you look at the people here, this is the range of loss of thresholds for normal hearing from here below. And there are some people in that upper left corner. Those are people who had very low thresholds that were very much like the very best of our normal hearing listeners, and who did really, really well on this task. So there was enormous variability. It wasn't particularly related to the degree of hearing loss, actually. The other thing to know is all of these listeners we did test for the audibility of the sound, but we didn't compensate for the loss that they had. So definitely the perceived spectrum that these guys are hearing is different than the perceived spectrum, because some of these people had high frequency loss. It was broadband sound. So there were differences like that we absolutely did not control for. So there's lots of different things one could do to push this more, but This was just like the first kind of attempt, yeah.
Do you expect that the activity would change if you train them over multiple trials to use visual cues to regain scene?
Yeah, that's a great question. The question was, if you trained them to use the visual cues, do you think you could train them to use attention? You know, and I don't know the answer. I would suspect not, just because these people, you know, they were getting better than chance performance. They were doing the task, and to do the task, they had to do it based on location because these sounds did not differ except in their locations. So they were, even though they were bad at it and didn't look like they were effectively using this alpha kind of push-pull of attention, spatial attention, they were using spatial attention, just not well and not effectively. Yeah. So I'm going to end with one last little tidbit, which is the thing I'm most kind of excited about, the newest stuff. So this is brain stimulation. So here we have a montage. We're going to stimulate the brain. We're going to inject current into the brain using alternating current. And this is done with Rob Reinhardt, who's a professor at BU who's done a lot of this kind of stimulation stuff. He uses a high density alternating current or direct current stimulation. So there are many electrodes, a montage of electrodes. Most of the earlier studies have been done with just a single anode and cathode. But by doing this, you can get fairly focal, it's really quite gross, but fairly focal stimulation. And what I'm showing you is the simulation for the montage we used on a kind of a generic brain model, so it's not individualized in any way, but we tried to stimulate parietal cortex on the right side of the head. So if you advance again, what we're going to do is inject alternating current alpha on the right side of the head. And the logic goes like this. This alpha is associated with suppression of information. But you don't know, at least in parietal cortex during spatial attention. It turns out alpha is a very common oscillation that you'll see. You'll see a strong band of energy of oscillations in many different kinds of neural activity. But in the parietal cortex, this alpha is actually associated with suppression. And what we did is a sham session where we turned on and off the electrode, so you felt a little tingle on the side, both at the beginning and the end of this little 10-minute session. Or we did an actual stimulation session. And so what we're going to do is stimulate the right side. In the normal sham session, the normal alpha activity should be present. So if I'm attending on the top left to the left, I should see an increase in alpha ipsilaterally on the left and a decrease in alpha on the right. But if I'm listening to the right, I should see the opposite. So blue and red up there are denoting this change in alpha. If I am actually stimulating the brain, we're going to inject current into the right. And so the natural alpha will be high on the left, and then I'm going to make it artificially high by injecting current on the right. That should interfere with attending the things on the left, because if this is a causal thing, not just an epiphenomenon of attention, if alpha is causally related, then putting this alpha in should cause suppression of things on the left, making you bad there. But it shouldn't really necessarily do much if I'm attending to the right, where there's already high alpha. So advance. So we're going to expect to see disruption of attention here in this attend to the left case. And of course, that's obviously when somebody shows you, like, yeah, I wouldn't be talking about it if it didn't work. Here, it worked, look. So what we're comparing is how much did attention performance change in percent correct during a sham session versus when we stimulated. This is when people are attending to the left, and you see a decrease. You can see the individual subjects. Not everybody showed the effect. There were a couple that didn't. You don't see it when you're attending to the right. You also don't see it if you stimulate at another frequency. This is a theta frequency, which is a lower frequency. It also turns out, if you advance again, you see it for left attention, but not right attention. The effect size is big for this kind of study. It's not whopping, but it's bigger than average. And advance one more. It turns out this, if we take the block of trials where we were stimulating and compare it to what happens when you're not stimulating and break it down over time, you see it's only present during the stimulation. We also tested them right afterwards, and the minute we turned off the stimulation, this effect went away. That's not true for a lot of the direct current stimulation studies, which seem to be changing sort of the actual, the neural structure, kind of make things more plastic and stuff like that. This is not the same kind of effect. This is a temporally focal effect of causing suppression, and then it goes away. Advance one more time. So I thought there was another, let me just say in words then, I thought there was another slide. The other thing to know is we actually did that exact same experiment. In some blocks, people were not paying attention to location, but were paying attention to the voice, because it was a male and a female talker. Stimulating these parietal areas had 0 effect. For exactly the same stimuli, it had 0 effect if you were doing the task not using space. So this is just more convincing evidence that there are these networks that are spatial networks that you engage when you're using spatial attention, and you can actually cause effects from stimulation. So to wrap up, what does this all mean? I think it's pretty interesting if you advance a few times, stop there. So, I mean, imagine what you could do with these sorts of things. If you put it all together with technology, we now have the ability to kind of separate sounds from using deep learning networks. You can read out what the listener intent is using EEG. You can decode it. You could then figure out, if you are smart, what to amplify and what to suppress. If you know what the listener's trying to do, you can help them. But if I'm stuck facing the really boring guy and I'm trying to listen over here, it's not something visible except through the brain. You have to read the brain to know what the listener's really trying to do. And if you could put all these together, advance, you could even add in stimulation as a way of biasing what people are able to do and helping them in that way. So, go back one. What did we talk about? We talked about career life compromise. It's possible, and you can become a neuroscience director even if you've never ever done neuroscience. That's kind of fun to know. There's these brain networks that are biased towards different sensory modalities, but it turns out they're shared. You can actually co-opt the visual spatial network if you're doing spatial processing in the auditory system. In the back of the brain, that's part of that parietal, visual parietal spatial network. That network actually reflects exactly where you're paying attention. This laterality of alpha shows that. And yet you may or may not even maintain that sort of spatial attention in the auditory domain. If there's other features that allow you to solve the problem, you may not rely on that. Hearing impairment is a problem. It makes all of this harder. And when it makes it harder, it actually even makes the control of attention less clear. And it turns out you can actually use stimulation to bias attention now that you understand what the networks are really doing. And all of this could be put together to make cool devices, which is kind of fun for all the engineers in the audience. So I'll just end with that. And I apologize for the late start and running 5 minutes late. And if people have time for questions, I'm happy to stay and answer some. Thank you.
So for those who need to go, obviously, please feel free to go. But Barb, as she said, is happy to stick around and answer a few questions. So anybody have questions?
So I'm trying to relate this back to your original statement about the cocktail party effect. My understanding of the cocktail party effect is obviously what you said, but in addition, it's actually paying attention to the person you're looking at, not trying to eavesdrop on somewhere else. So in that case, my question is, how much of the spatial attention effect is involved
in the real world?
Well, in what I understand is a cocktail effect, because you're staring at somebody and they're saying something, but you're having trouble because of all the background noise.
So I'm going to repeat the question because of the remote. So I'm going to paraphrase. The question is, his understanding of the cocktail party problem is you're staring at somebody and focusing on them, and it's hard to pay attention because of all the background noise. Is that fair? A fair recapitulation? And the question then is how much?
Where is the attention center there? Is it in the
is it visual
cortex, or is it
yeah, so
or both?
Yeah, where would attention be in that case? I would actually say my impression of the cocktail party problem, so there's a couple things to say. If you're hearing impaired, looking at who is talking turns out to be critical in a crowded setting because the acoustic cues are no longer enough to support attention. I'm at a point where my hearing has gotten bad enough, just due to normal aging and susceptibility to that, that I need speech cues on the lips to help me understand speech in a noisy setting, if it's really noisy. So in that sense, looking at the person who's talking can be really critical in a true cocktail party if you have an impairment of any kind or if it's too noisy. But I actually think that for a young, healthy adult, it's absolutely the case that they don't have to be looking at the person who they're trying to understand, and they can eavesdrop, and that is a problem that is fascinating. And that's so a lot of the things we are doing in my lab are trying to understand the processes that enable that and the parts of the brain that are engaged during that kind of shifting of attention, irrespective of where you're looking. In all of the experiments I showed you, people's eyes are fixed in front and not moving. And it turns out that the minute you move your eyes, there are all sorts of effects that are electrical artifact as well as changes in the brain reaction. If the second part to your question was, what parts of the brain would be engaged by attention in a regular cocktail party when you are looking at someone? Would it be frontal? Would it be parietal? The answer is, it's always a network. The frontal parietal network is what's engaged by visual spatial attention. And it could be visual attention, which is always spatial. I mean, we can argue about the way I just use those words. For a vision scientist, there's attention to color. But once you attend to color, you get an object, which is at a location, and it will engage these networks. Even it doesn't start from attention from this network, it starts from somewhere else. It will end up focusing you on a place on your retina that is a spatial location, and it will involve frontal and parietal and visual cortex all working together. So it is a network activity, and if I'm using space in the auditory domain, I will engage that network, which is not always engaged during listening, but only engaged during listening that is spatial.
Hi. Could you introduce confusion into the sort of spatial and auditory mixing if you were to say put sound sources that don't match the supposed spatial location of it? Like you had a male voice that's supposedly coming from here, but it's matched to a female person first.
Yeah, so can we confuse the system by messing up the cues, like playing a sound from the left that's male with a female face in the left, for instance? The answer is absolutely. And the other thing that's even funny, like we play mean games where we say, pay attention to the thing on the left, whether it changes talker or not. And it might start out being female, 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 male, male. And usually if that happens, it's going male, 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 female, female. Which means that there's a female voice that if you trust the femaleness over the space, it should jump. And it turns out, even if I tell you ahead of time, it's going to change from male to female or vice versa. Ignore that and tell me what came from the left. You are messed up by the fact it jumps in space. So your brain can use space, but it doesn't really trust space. The natural tendency is to stream things, to connect things based on their non-spatial features in sound. And so there can be mismatches even through time, let alone mismatches between the voice quality and the sound quality, the visual quality and the voice quality, which also undoubtedly would mess you up, although I haven't studied that explicitly.
This might be a little outside of the scope of what you say, but do visually impaired individuals have the same audio-visual spatial network?
It's a great question. So the question was, do people with visual impairment have the same networks, and are they differentiated in the same way? I don't really know the answer. There's some people who I've collaborated with who have studied blind individuals. And there's a lot of plasticity in the system. And for a blind individual, parts of visual cortex end up being more responsive to sound than they would be in a sighted individual. It's almost like the system is using that information. What's really funky about all of this, though, is that it's not really clear. I don't know the answer to whether they have a left versus right representation. If they were blind from birth, for instance, there's a lot of evidence from animal model work that some of these representation co-registrations of sound onto retinotopic mappings is learned. So it's not clear that if you were born blind, you might be able to use space, but whether it's used in the same way as you and me, I don't know the answer, and I don't know of anyone offhand who's looked at that really. So it's a great question, but one that's a pain in the ass to study compared to taking young adults and paying them $10 an hour to come sit for hours at a time.
Do you think that contralateral alpha stimulation can be incorporated into hearing aids in the future?
Do I think that this brain stimulation of contralateral suppression could be incorporated into hearing devices in the future? And the answer is, I wouldn't be doing it if I didn't think that would be a fun thing to think about. And it's really actually even more interesting than that. 15 years ago, my students, if they didn't stay in academia, ended up going into finances and anything that used complex modeling and forecasting and stuff. Now they're being snatched up by Apple and Bose and Oculus and you name it, tech company. All of the tech companies are getting into this, and many of them are doing things specifically with the idea of building active hearing devices that make use of brain signals in one way or another, and including developing electrodes that sit in the ear canal as part of an ear insert, which is trivial to do, and it turns out you can pick up a lot of the signals you care about. If you know in time what to look for, you don't need a whole electrode array. You can just look at the time points you care about, maybe. So with just a few electrodes, you actually can maybe do something quite interesting. The thing that's interesting also to think about is this alpha stimulation. We had more success with stimulating with alpha than actually reading alpha as a way of reading out intention. In that I showed you some individual results for individual listeners and relationships, but never for alpha, because it's really messy to measure. It's a much noisier thing to pull out, and you need more time and more averaging across listeners and across time to make the results look as pretty as the stuff I showed you. So I've had some friends trying to use alpha as another real-time indicator of attentional focus. Doesn't work so well because it's really noisy and it's hard, the signal processing, it's hard to pull it, to isolate that alpha that I'm showing you from all the other sources of oscillation that happen in the brain. Even though at the gross level, over lots of averaging, you can see the effects quite clearly, it's not something you can use directly, but you can, by stimulating the right place in the brain, inject the right thing to bias things a little bit, maybe.
Did you try other frequencies besides alpha? And what were the results you saw?
Yeah, so the only thing we did was what I showed you, which was stimulated. The question was, did we use other frequencies? We stimulated at alpha, and we stimulated at theta in parietal cortex, which we didn't think would mess you up. And we haven't yet done anything else. It turns out I moved from to Carnegie Mellon right after this was, we're still analyzing the data when I left. We're about to set up and start some more brain stimulation studies with a newer technology that allows you to do trial by trial control. We had to do block design control because you couldn't turn it on and off in any way synchronized with the other things going on. Now we can. If you stimulate other parts of the brain, like auditory cortex with theta, it would interfere because there's a lot of theta activity it's related to like syllabic level fluctuations in the sound that are tracked in auditory cortex. And if you play with theta and put it into that into auditory cortex, it would interfere with the natural coding. People are showing that. We only were stimulating in parietal cortex, which is only really involved in spatial processing of the auditory sounds, which is redundant, but you know what I meant. And so we didn't expect to see effects of delta and didn't. But depending on where you're stimulating, other oscillations or other stimulation would have an effect. There are a handful of studies out there. There's like 3 or 4 groups that I know of that are starting to play this game in the auditory domain, and there's many more in the visual domain.
Maybe one more question? Last question, John.
The question I have is, if you're a hunter-gatherer society, and then the spatial thing is important, do you think the brain might behave the same way?
If I'm a hunter-gatherer and the spatial...
Survival depends on spatial.
Right. And so the question was, would the brain behave even more this way or differently?
It might be different. It might look at both sides. It has to listen to all sides.
Okay, so
would space
Without
would space be elevated in importance? Yeah.
yeah. So the question, again, just to repeat for the people who are live streaming, would space be even more important if we're a hunter-gatherer? I would argue whatever's going on evolved from being a hunter-gatherer, and I think it's more driven by that kind of evolutionary scale than it is by me sitting at my desk every day has changed how much I use space versus not. I would argue that these networks are kind of long-standing existing networks. So I don't know how much short-term experience actually fine-tunes them, which I think is kind of behind the question. I suspect not a whole lot. I think people may become better and more efficient at using the information, but the networks would remain the same. And if I were a hunter-gatherer and wanted to be omni-aware of things from all directions, I still think I would end up serially sampling things, because I think that's ultimately what we do. If I'm trying to detect sound from any direction, I can turn off spatial attention and just let through sound and try and match, listen for sounds that match the content that I'm interested in. But once I latch onto a sound from a particular direction and try and hone in on only that direction to throw out everything else so that I can say what it is or not, I would get this kind of focal attention, I think. I think that's how we process. But that's all speculation, not science. It's like, yeah, it's not real science.
Let's think more together.